CGTN, China Global Television Network. Live from London, this is Global Business.
Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Jamie Owen. Our top stories. The death toll from the earthquakes in Syria and Turkey reaches 41,000 people as the United Nations appeals for funding to try to rebuild the region. Our other headlines: politics is brutal, the words of Scotland's First Minister Nicola Sturgeon as she resigns. Where now for the independence movement? Thousands of Lufthansa passengers find themselves stranded after the airline is hit by an IT meltdown. And why some of the world's top football clubs are missing out on millions of dollars by not understanding their fans. The death toll from the earthquakes in Syria and Turkey has now reached 41,000 people. The rescue operations are still continuing, with survivors still being uncovered 8 days after this disaster. 3 people have been found alive since Tuesday. A 77-year-old woman has been pulled from the rubble in the Turkish city of Adıyaman, while 2 young brothers were found in Kahramanmaraş. The United Nations is appealing for $400 million in aid for Syria, warning of the rising risk of disease. Well, let's talk to our correspondent, Shamim Chowdhury, who's in Turkey. We've seen pretty desperate scenes today. What are you seeing? What's the situation where you are now?
Well, Jamie, I'm in the city of Maraş, in the city centre, and it is a city decimated. I'm just going to step aside very quickly to give you a very quick sense of it. Now, just bear in mind, this was a very modern city. All the mountains of rubble that you see here were buildings. It is row upon row upon row upon row of mountains of rubble. Now, there's no electricity here. There used to be about 500,000 people living here. There is nobody here at the moment. And this is the scene that we're seeing in some of the worst hit areas. Now, we are hearing cases of some people being rescued, like the examples that you just gave, but it really has to be borne in mind that this is few and far between. It's very much become an operation of finding bodies now. You've already said that it's gone over 40,000. That's including Syria. It is expected that the numbers could rise much, much more. And as you can see, what the bulldozers are doing behind me, it's very much an operation of clearing debris as well.
Shamim, it seems almost insensitive given the industrial numbers of people who've died, but people there are beginning to talk about the rebuilding operation and what lies ahead.
Well, they are talking about it. The government has talked about it. The president has talked about it. The plan is to start rebuilding. It's about, 30,000, perhaps even more, buildings that have completely collapsed. And the idea, the pledge, is to start building those as soon as possible. Whether that's going to be possible or not is anyone's guess, bearing in mind that many property developers have been arrested because they are accused of building substandard constructions. So it's a question of resources, manpower. It's a country that has just come out of COVID. Inflation is around about 80%. I mean, there are a myriad of challenges. Whether any of those pledges will come to any kind of fruition is anyone's guess. In the meantime, we've got nearly 200,000 people who have been made homeless, who have been evacuated. There's a short-term plan that needs to be made as well. At the moment, they're staying in tents or in university dormitories. But really, this is just going to be for the next kind of couple of months or so. What happens after that? It's going to take a generation, some would say, to rebuild this country.
Shamim, what is the government saying? There have been dozens of arrests in Turkey over social media posts criticising the government and their handling of this disaster.
Well, there have been arrests on a number of fronts, Jamie, not just the example that you've given, although that certainly is the case. Also, there have been arrests for people who have been putting up fake donation accounts, trying to raise money fraudulently, claiming it's for rescue efforts when it turns out it hasn't. People have been arrested for the example that I just gave you for, in fact, more than 100 or so arrest warrants have been issued for architects, for building developers, construction developers and property magnates who are accused of building substandard buildings that have collapsed. And in addition to that, people have been more than several dozen or so have been arrested for looting. So there's an entire investigation on many levels going out. It's kind of being branded as earthquake crimes. So, and all of that is pending. And the government is saying that it will certainly prosecute anyone found guilty of any of these crimes.
Shamim, thank you. Our correspondent Shamim Chowdhury in Turkey. Well, many of the foreign rescue teams in Turkey's earthquake zones are now going home. Over a week has passed, and the focus is shifting to those needing medical treatment. But many of the hospitals were damaged in the earthquake and can no longer provide care. So foreign medical teams are trying to fill the gaps. Our correspondent Evangelo Sipsas reports.
The public health system is on the brink of collapse. Medical resources have been stretched to the limit. But some international medical teams are providing relief here in Iskenderun. Across of a damaged hospital, the Indian Army has set up a field hospital, treating those injured in the earthquakes.
What we had were more of trauma patients who were buried in the rubble for many hours. And we conducted an amputation also, a life and limb saving surgeries. So the initial patients were more of surgical type trauma, which we have 2 orthopedic surgeons, 2 surgeons, and critical care specialists. So we took care of them. We did, now the patient profile is changing. Now gradually the infectious disease kind of patients are coming, gastrointestinal infections, your respiratory infections, post-traumatic stress disorders.
This school is now serving as a hospital, scrambling to provide aid for those injured. It also serves as a primary trauma center in the Hatay region, as the government struggles to cope with a disaster of this scale, leaving thousands of injured people to rely on help from around the world. On the other side of the city, Roberto and his team have also set up a field hospital. Unlike the Indian Army, they also provide aid to primary patients, from medicine and psychological support to checkups and x-rays.
Like we provide a complete service for this kind of catastrophes. It's not only trauma. We have all these services around to support both the people affected directly by this situation, and also to cover the needs that appear once the local health services are not available anymore.
Many of the rescue missions have now ended, and teams have already left, leaving the field to the medical teams. With thousands injured and over 1 million left homeless, those living in tents and make-up shelters, there is a risk of a widespread outbreak of disease, making centers like this one vital in the days to come. Evangelo Sipsas for CGTN in Iskenderun, Turkey.
Well, the first convoy of United Nations aid has arrived in northwest Syria through one of 2 newly reopened border crossings. The parts of Syria worst hit by last week's quake are in rebel-held areas. Syria's President Assad wanted all international aid to be routed through Damascus, and his main backer, Russia, was threatening to use its Security Council veto to keep all but one border crossing to Turkey closed. But the Syrian regime now says both border crossings will stay open for the next 3 months. Well, let's talk to Tony O'Riordan, the country director with the Jesuit Refugee Services Group in Syria. Tony, welcome to the programme. Good to see you. Presumably many people homeless. In your judgment, based on what you've seen, will they become refugees abroad, or will they stay internally displaced within Syria?
That's a very difficult question to answer. I think right now people are just thinking about getting through tonight, where the temperatures will be sub-zero, and people are living hour to hour and are also labouring under the rubble. We hear very much about the people who have died under the weight of buildings. The survivors, the millions of survivors, are now living under the weight of stress and trauma and fear from the terrific hours of about 12 hours of terror, and also facing the uncertainty of the future, many without a home to go to, many fearing that the homes that they have left may be destroyed because they are unsafe, and the situation of their future is quite uncertain.
Tony, we've been reporting on the difficulty of getting aid into Syria. In your judgment, what is the aid situation now in northern Syria?
Well, the first response for aid came internally from Syrians, from across even the affected areas. People did what they could, and across Syria in the unaffected areas. So some aid, like immediate things like some blankets and some food, started to flow. Then it's begun to flow from neighbouring countries. So some aid is getting through to the people most in need. The issue is that the scale of the need is so great that the aid is not getting through in volumes, or other aid that is needed, such as medical care, such as appropriate shelter. The response for this is not really showing any evidence on the ground yet, and the shelter is a critical one, as well as the psychosocial intervention. There are two things preventing people from returning to their homes in normality. That is adequate shelter, and also dealing with the fear that they experience. So we need aid at that level and material assistance.
And why are we seeing these hold-ups in aid? Is it possible to pinpoint the obstacles?
I think it's just the logistics of getting the aid in, and then the coordination of getting the aid to the people. We're a small organisation that we've been on the ground for the last 12 years, so we have good relations and knowledge of the area. For the mobilisation of groups who are just arriving in Aleppo now, it takes some time to identify the areas that need the needs. So I think there's just a logistic and a coordination issue. And I'm hopeful that the aid can get through, but the aid also needs resourcing. So people are mobilising with funding, and governments are mobilising. But I think we need greater speed on this, because there's a risk of secondary casualties because of cold, because of unable to access medical care, and people will die from preventable causes.
Tony, good luck. I hope we can talk to you again in coming days. Tony O'Riordan, the country director with the Jesuit Refugee Services Group in Syria. Well, relief supplies from China have begun to arrive in Syria to help in the earthquake assistance program. China has mobilized nearly 600 emergency workers to the areas affected. CGTN's correspondent Zhang Yibing reports now from Damascus.
Humanitarian supplies financed by the Chinese government has just arrived in Syria to help the people affected by earthquake in the northern country. This is by far the largest humanitarian aid from China after the 2 batches of medical supplies by the Red Cross Society of China arrived in Syria in recent days. We heard from the Chinese embassy in the country that the materials just arrived with about 80 tons. These materials include 30,000 first aid kits, 10,000 cotton paddy jackets, 300 tents, and 20,000 blankets, as well as ventilators, anesthesia machines, oxygen generators, and others. These materials will be handed over to Syria Red Crescent, then distributed to the quake-hit areas. As we mentioned about the 2 shipments of medical supplies of the Red Cross Society of China. They arrived in Damascus in the past week. They support some 15,000 people in northern Syria. The materials just arrived, a part of the step-up the efforts from China. They are expected to reach more people in the quake-affected areas. Zhang Yibing, CGTN, Damascus.
You're watching CGTN. Still ahead, grounded and going nowhere. Thousands of passengers around the world stranded after an IT meltdown at Germany's Lufthansa.
Ever wondered what's the difference between a bear and a bull market? Where are the cash cows? And who are the lame ducks? And what exactly are black swans? Grey rhinos? And unicorn companies? Make sense of it all with Global Business, only on CGTN.
There's a new agenda for a new world, accelerating change in almost every part of our lives. It's shifting the norms of how we work, travel, and connect. How we think, interact, and develop. It's a new reality, a new agenda with me, Juliet Mann.
Hello, welcome back to Global Business Europe. Quick reminder, CGTN is available to watch for free on all of the major digital platforms, on Smart TV or online at Roku, Apple TV, Amazon Fire and Android TV, YouTube, Dailymotion, CGTN.com and the CGTN app, and in the UK on Freeview. Thousands of passengers all around the world have been left stranded after a company-wide IT failure at Germany's flagship airline, Lufthansa. More than 200 flights have been grounded at Frankfurt Airport. The carrier said engineering works at a railway station in the city had damaged underground fibre-optic cables. Lufthansa says some of those cables have now been repaired. Paul Charles is a travel expert and chief executive of travel consultancy, the PC Agency.
Wasn't what Lufthansa needed at the start of what has so far been a pretty successful year for the carrier. It's one of Europe's most profitable, of course, and with its 700 aircraft in the fleet, it seems to be able to bypass any major issues. But it's been brought down today by this fibre optic cable disruption under Frankfurt railway station, seemingly something very simple. And the problem has been with not just Lufthansa, but also other carriers, especially in Europe, is that, of course, they lost many of their IT experts during the pandemic. They were put on furlough, they left the industry for more lucrative pay packages outside of aviation, and airlines simply haven't been able to get back that level of expertise. And so their IT systems have been pretty underinvested in over the last 2 years.
Paul, their critics would say they're simply not spending enough money on their IT systems or their people.
I think most airlines have not spent enough money on their IT systems. It's been a particular issue affecting a number of carriers, especially British Airways, of course, not just Lufthansa over the last couple of years. And they need to. They need to make sure they are spending as much as some of the big online retailers spend on their IT systems, because most of us traveling now, even if we're using a travel agent or a tour operator or just going direct, we need to ensure the airline systems are really watertight. So Lufthansa is suffering after what, over the last year, has been a very successful period for them.
How bad is this in terms of cost and reputation? I mean, as customers, do we forgive companies and just forget it and book another flight, or does it go longer than that?
Generally, we do forgive after a while. It's price that determines whether we book with an airline, so if the prices fall low enough, we'll keep booking. But one of the issues that Lufthansa faces this week is, in effect, for their passengers, 5 days of disruption, because there is a major union strike affecting 7 German airports on Friday, and that 24-hour strike is going to disrupt operations for 2 or 3 days, on top of today's disruption, which itself will lead to cancellations and delays for the next 48 hours. So this little IT issue, or what seemed to be a little issue at the start of it, will turn into a 5-day nightmare for some passengers and indeed for Lufthansa until it gets its operation back to normal.
And just to be sure, Paul, we're not missing anything here. This is simply a question of someone drilling through the cables. This isn't about a hack or anything else, as far as you know.
There is no indication of that. Obviously, we have seen cyber attacks on some airlines in the last few weeks, even SAS, a Scandinavian airline, admitting it faced an attack earlier this week. But there's no indication of that whatsoever. This is simply down to some engineering work which went badly wrong and will cost Lufthansa somewhere in the region potentially of 40 or 50 million euros. Of course, that's very small numbers compared with the profit that it made in 2022 of over 1.5 billion euros.
Well, as Paul Charles mentioned there, workers from across 7 German airports are set for a 24-hour walkout on Friday over a wage dispute. The German trade union Verdi called for the mass strike, saying talks had made little progress. The industrial action is expected to cause considerable disruption, particularly for domestic travellers. And just staying with flying for a moment, the US aircraft manufacturer Boeing could be facing more problems. Air safety officials are to investigate why a Boeing 777 suddenly plummeted 1,400 feet in December and almost crashed into the Pacific. Let's talk now to our correspondent, John Terrett in New York. John, this is pretty disturbing and unfortunately not the first time we've talked about Boeing's having problems staying in the sky.
I know. Boeing is a bit of a troubled company at the moment for all sorts of reasons, Jamie. It's kind of based around the 737 MAX and those crashes in Indonesia and Ethiopia, but other things as well. Cracks have been appearing in their plastic plane, the Dreamliner, and very many other things too. But let's put those to one side because this was an absolutely terrifying incident. As you say, we're only just learning about it now in the last couple of days. It happened back in December as a Boeing aircraft was flying from Maui, which is in the Hawaiian Islands, to San Francisco. Now, this was a United Airlines flight. It was operated by United. United is one of the big 3 airlines that we have in America now, so you see their planes all around the world. If you're coming to America, it could be a United flight or a Delta flight or an American Airlines flight. This was United, and it was a Boeing 777-200. Now, these planes are big. They're not jumbo jets by name, but they are jumbo jets, if you see what I mean. It's a huge aircraft. And what happened was, suddenly, it fell from 2,200 feet up in the sky just after takeoff from Maui to 775 feet just above the ocean. I mean, that is a really long fall. And in fact, the rate of fall is 8,600 feet a minute. I mean, that, can you imagine? It's extraordinary. And the whole episode lasted about 45 seconds, which is a lifetime, really, in aviation. And it happened during heavy rain after takeoff from the Hawaiian Islands. Now, I have a little bit of experience of this. When I was in Baghdad in 2005, we flew down to Basra, and we had an incident on aircraft, which forced the pilot to push the control column forward, and the aircraft goes down like that. And what happens is you experience weightlessness, just like the astronauts who are training to go into space. That's how they do it over at NASA. They put them in a jumbo jet and they push the control column forward. The aircraft goes down steeply and the astronauts get the experience of what it's like to be weightless. And that's what happened to us, and that's what would have happened to these poor passengers with families. Journalists have been seeking them out now, and they're saying that they were absolutely terrified, and it comes after a series of incidents involving US aviation since Christmas time, including aircraft landing too close to each other on the same runway and terrible weather conditions forcing planes into great difficulty. So it's a bit of a problem here at the moment. Now, the one good thing for Boeing, just very briefly, is that Boeing and Airbus have got a deal with Tata, the giant Indian corporation which runs Air India these days. I know we did this on our program yesterday, but that's likely to put Boeing back into profitability. However, the share price is down about 1% at the moment, even though that deal covers 500 aircraft split between Boeing and Airbus.
Let's talk about inflation. That's the other big story doing the rounds there today. More key inflation data, John.
Yes, and once again, the economists have got it wrong. And we keep saying this on our program, and every time they're just out by several points. This was a real resurgence for retail sales, so that's buying and selling in shops within the whole of America in the month of January. And it was, in fact, up the most in almost 2 years. You've got to go back to March 2021 to find an increase on this scale. Now, economists had expected that retail sales would be up by 1.8% after they declined in December. But as I've said, they were up by 3%, and it was all sectors as well. I've got some examples here. For automobiles, up 6.4%. Department stores, up 17.5%. And for restaurants and food, up 7.2%. So this is something the Federal Reserve will be looking at very, very closely, along with the numbers that we had yesterday. And there's another CPI inflation report out due before they next meet in the middle of March. So, it's all pointing to an economy that is going to avoid a recession, which is what these people think is going to happen, but which the Federal Reserve is not taking any chances on and is still being very hawkish. They were all out there yesterday talking about this, and it rattled the markets because of what they were saying about going on to increase interest rates, even though these people think there's no need to do it much anymore.
And no edition of this programme can pass without mention of Elon Musk, but no. he may be ready to step aside. Well,
I know. When I told you he would do it, I said he would, and it seems that we have a timeline now for it. He was speaking in Dubai at something called the World Government Summit. Can you imagine how boring that must have been? But anyway, he obviously livened things up, because what he said yesterday was that, yeah, OK, I may well have somebody to replace me at Twitter by the end of 2023. And this is what all the critics of what he's done over at Twitter have been calling for. They want him to go back to run Tesla and SpaceX. So this is what he said. He said, I think I need to stabilize the organization, that's Twitter, and just make sure it's in a financially healthy place, and that the product roadmap is clearly laid out. The product roadmap. How's that for jargon? Nobody really knows what the product roadmap is. But anyway, he said it, and he could well be gone by the end of the year back to SpaceX and Twitter. And indeed, Tesla shares, Tesla and SpaceX rather, Tesla shares are having a great January. They were down around $100 each in December. Now they're way up above 200 again, and up 1/3 just now. Finally, he was seen, this is Elon Musk, sitting right next door to Rupert Murdoch at the Super Bowl on Sunday. The camera panned in right to them. And so it is thought that maybe, just maybe, whoever replaces him might come from the Murdoch organization, News Corporation and News International. No one knows, of course, but we will find out on Twitter.
We will. John, intriguing. Thank you for that. We'll talk to you tomorrow, no doubt. Our correspondent, John Terrett in New York. UK inflation rose last month, but the pace of the increase in the cost of living continues to slow. Annual inflation hit 10.1% in January. That was down from 10.5% the month before. Economists say the fall in fuel prices and cheaper eating out have helped to cool household bills, but inflation remains at a 40-year high, around 5 times higher than the Bank of England's target of 2%. China's once booming gaming sector has posted a decline in sales for the first time since 2005. Video gaming sales dropped by more than 10% year-on-year to $39 billion in 2022. That decline comes as homegrown game developers eye overseas markets, and Beijing applies stricter regulation on gaming content. You're watching CGTN. Still ahead, Scotland's First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon's shock resignation. Where now for the independence movement?
Each day, there are millions of stories. Each one can open new perspectives, new possibilities. Wherever you look, we are there. To see, discover, explore. We put the pieces together to find what really matters to you. All around the world, all around the clock. Our reporters are at home across the globe. From our headquarters in Beijing, and production centers in Washington, Nairobi, and London. China Global Television Network. Stories from across the globe, reaching people across the globe. CGTN. See the difference. Facing the unknown is always difficult. In a world in turmoil, it's easy to lose orientation. But when the storms come, we have to see the possibilities, reinvent, find new opportunities, discover a path forward. CGTN. See the difference.
What do we mean when we talk about the difference? The difference is in the detail, in the background,
defense ministers from
the wider angle and perspective of every story, wherever the story may be. CGTN. See the difference.
Hello, welcome back to Global Business Europe with me, Jamie Owen. Our top stories: the death toll from the earthquakes in Syria and Turkey reaches 41,000 people as the United Nations appeals for funding to help rebuild the region. Our other headlines: thousands of Lufthansa passengers find themselves stranded after the airline is hit by an IT meltdown. NATO defence ministers have ended their two-day meeting in Brussels, focusing on military spending and Ukraine's demand for an increasing supply of weapons and ammunition. Our correspondent Alex Cadier is watching events for us in Brussels. Alex, how much progress, if any, have NATO ministers made in their 2 days of talks?
Well, the message from NATO is that they're in it for the long haul. They will support Ukraine in the face of Russia's invasion as long as it takes. And so in that sense, there's been some progress made, and it's about that longevity, that long-term vision, looking at stockpiles of munitions across the NATO alliance. That is the big focus that Jens Stoltenberg brought to this meeting, the Secretary-General of NATO, saying that at the moment the Ukrainians are using ammunition faster than NATO can backfill it across the alliance. So the big push there was for more contracts, more deals with defence industries across the alliance. The French have struck deals with their munitions providers. The Norwegians, the Americans also striking similar deals to make sure that depletion of the stockpiles is either reduced or stopped altogether. So that is the focus in the long run. And again, with that long-term vision, being able to stand by Ukraine for as long as it takes, talking about the amount of defence spending across the alliance, that 2% of GDP target that a lot of members are not hitting yet. Officials are saying that they will hit that target within 3 years. We're pushing for that to happen as quickly as possible. We've seen Poland committing to raising its defence spending, for example. Let's have a listen to what the Secretary-General Jens Stoltenberg said specifically about this point.
If it was right to commit to spend 2% in 2014, it is even more right now, because we live in a more dangerous world. There is a full-fledged war going on in Ukraine, in Europe, and then we see the persistent threat of terrorism, and we see also the challenges that China is posing to our security. So it is obvious that we need to spend more.
Alex, at the same time in Brussels, EU members are about to discuss, I'm not sure of the timing, another round of sanctions, economic sanctions on Russia. Do we know yet what they're likely to contain?
Yeah, we have a sense of what they'll contain. It's the 10th round of sanctions. It obviously has to go through the EU process. It's been proposed by the Commission and has to be debated now by member states, and that's what's happening at the moment. Now, it's the 10th round of sanctions. It is expected to come out and be matching the timing of the anniversary of the invasion of Ukraine. There's a proposal for 4 more Russian banks to be removed from the SWIFT messaging system, rubber and asphalt to be added as import bans into the EU. The objective broadly is to have a $11 billion trade loss for Russia. That is what the Commission is estimating these sanctions would result in if they were passed. There's also specifically bans on companies or entities linked to Iran's Revolutionary Guard, and that is a new and an expanded area for these sanctions, the European sanctions, specifically targeting companies that might have been involved in providing technology that helps with those drones that we've been seeing Russia use and being provided from Iran. So that is the kind of broadening of this sanctions package. The EU wants to send a very clear message that they will keep up the pressure on Russia financially for as long as it takes and for as long as the invasion continues. Jamie.
Alex, thank you for that. Our correspondent Alex Cadier in Brussels. China plans to resume issuing short-term visas to travellers from South Korea from Saturday. The ban was introduced in January after Seoul imposed COVID restrictions on people arriving from China. The South Korean government lifted the curbs last week, saying infections among Chinese arrivals have dropped. At least 4 people, including a child, have died as Cyclone Gabrielle swept through New Zealand's North Island. Rescue helicopters have recovered over 300 people stranded on rooftops. A magnitude 6 earthquake also struck off the coast of the North Island near the capital, Wellington. The Prime Minister, Chris Hipkins, said there are grave concerns over the number of people missing. At least 73 migrants are missing and presumed dead after their boat capsized off the coast of Libya. Only 7 people are thought to have survived the shipwreck and in what is described in a dire condition in hospital. The boat had been heading to Europe, according to the United Nations. Libyan authorities have retrieved 11 bodies so far from the wreckage. Italy's former Prime Minister, Silvio Berlusconi, has been acquitted over allegations he paid witnesses to lie in an underage prostitution case. The judge in Milan said there was no case to answer. The scandal over the so-called Bunga Bunga parties helped to force Berlusconi out of office in 2011. He was accused of paying for sex with a 17-year-old exotic dancer. Scotland's First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, has resigned after more than 8 years as the head of the Scottish Government. She said her decision to step down has come from a place of duty and was not linked to a recent backlash over her strategy for securing Scottish independence and plans to reform gender laws. Our correspondent Andrew Wilson reports.
The Scottish First Minister had always been clear that she intended to fight the next general election on Scottish independence, so it was assumed she was in for a longer haul. But suddenly, on Wednesday, that was not the case.
This decision comes from a deeper and longer-term assessment. I know it might seem sudden, but I have been wrestling with it, albeit with oscillating levels of intensity for some weeks. Essentially, I've been trying to answer 2 questions. Is carrying on right for me? And more importantly, is me carrying on right for the country, for my party, and for the independence cause I have devoted my life to?
Nicola Sturgeon has been First Minister of Scotland for 8 years, and before that she was Deputy First Minister for a similar stretch. Her name was always associated with independence, and as a fierce opponent of Brexit in 2016, she was always clear that separation from the UK was her unshakable ambition.
The impact of Brexit on everybody in our country is going to be disastrous, and that's why I have a duty to allow people the choice to opt for something better.
In recent weeks, Sturgeon had faced a series of pressures, including questions over her party's finances and also criticism of a new Scottish law allowing easier gender identification, which was at odds with Westminster. And the Scottish National Party, in power for nearly 2 decades, has gathered a troubled record on national issues like healthcare and education. But Sturgeon has always been unapologetic for her support of minorities and those who struggle.
A manifesto that reflects our belief in the infinite possibilities open to the people of Scotland if we work together in the common good to build the kind of country we know we can be.
Nicola Sturgeon has made it clear she will remain in post until a successor can be found. She's also refused to say whom she would choose to take her place.
Andrew, this came as a bit of a surprise, didn't it?
It did. No one saw this coming. They thought something was in the air, but just simply because of the fortunes of the Scottish National Party and Nicola Sturgeon as leader were starting to wobble somewhat in the last few months. So perhaps they entertained the idea, but no. All of a sudden she's come out and said, for personal reasons, because she recognises herself as a divisive character, because it's been very hard being leader of the Scottish National Party for 8 years. She said many times in her resignation speech, I'm a human being like anyone else. I've just really thought it's better for me to go now rather than hang on for another few months or another year with a general election coming and so on and so forth. Now, that's an acceptable argument, but as time goes by today, the commentators have been commenting and the writers have been scribbling, and of course it's made it clearer just what a divisive figure Nicola Sturgeon was. Now, the Scottish National Party, when they took power in 2007 under Alex Salmond and then switched to Nicola Sturgeon 8 years ago, dominated Scottish politics. That was the only political voice to come out of Scotland, whereas it used to be dominated by the Labour Party. Then the Scottish National Party had been ruling the roost and pushing this independence agenda, which gathered all sorts of supporters and became a real steamroller, a real movement towards independence for Scotland, ending with the referendum in 2014. The only problem was they didn't get independence. Now, Nicola Sturgeon has nailed her political message to the mast of independence, and she has been saying over the past couple of years, we're going to go again, we're going to do it again, we are going to achieve independence. But that may start to look a little wobbly now, and that means that her enemies are starting to get some sort of pace, and there's been internal squabbles within the Scottish National Party. Because while she's had this big identity, this big charismatic presence as a leader advocating independence, there have been problems with alcoholism in Scotland, with healthcare, with education, and also an extreme gender identification reform bill about trans rights in Scotland that really became quite controversial and perhaps identified Nicola Sturgeon as not as sure-footed politically as she has been in the past, because that did not go comfortably through the Scottish Parliament and certainly did not go well with Westminster. So there will be reasons, her enemies will be identifying reasons why she's had to go, because she simply wasn't as effective as she had been in the past.
I mean, the UK, it's worth repeating, is made up of four separate countries, Scotland, England, Wales, Northern Ireland, and has faced the possibility, or the debate anyway, around a constitutional crisis for some time because of the power of the Scottish independence discussion. With Sturgeon gone, where does that leave Scottish independence, given that she was the great champion of Scottish independence?
There's a huge question mark over that, because it's not clear without Sturgeon where the momentum for that independence drive will continue to come from. It came strongly from Alex Salmond, her predecessor. It came extremely strongly from Nicola Sturgeon herself. There has been whispers in Northern Ireland also seeking some kind of independence in some political areas, looking at Scotland to see how they get on. And there's always been this fear in Westminster that Scotland would somehow achieve another referendum. Now, what Nicola Sturgeon did was bet the horses on another chance to have another referendum by taking it to the UK Supreme Court. The UK Supreme Court kicked it out. So Nicola Sturgeon said, I'm going to fight the next general election campaign purely on the issue of Scottish independence. That did not land quite as effectively as a political message. That put some blocks up on the momentum of the independence movement. With Sturgeon gone, that momentum will surely diminish as well. There will be the need for Scottish independence advocates to find another charismatic figure who is capable of holding centre stage, dominating the politics of Scotland and dominating the debate as far as Westminster is concerned as well. And that's not going to be easy.
I mean, there was no love lost between the UK government in London and the Scottish government. Presumably, the UK Conservative government will be opening the champagne tonight. One of their big political problems has walked off the stage.
I think they have, and the fact that they are rejoicing at Nicola Sturgeon's departure already shows us a number of things. It also shows us that she was extremely effective at what she did, and that they're glad that a fearsome enemy is now off the stage. But I think what's interesting is when she went after the gender recognition reform bill, the assumption was that this was antagonistic towards Westminster and that the British government would somehow have to strike a deal to go along with it, because people with trans rights in Scotland travelling south to England would have to have those same rights recognised. Rishi Sunak, as Prime Minister, said, no, we're not going to go along with that. And that really put the mockers on Nicola Sturgeon's momentum for that particular issue. It was an act of defiance from Westminster that many of her critics believe unseated her position in Scotland. So unwittingly or wittingly, Rishi Sunak has become the architect of dismantling some of the energy of the SNP's presence in Scotland, which means that they're going to have to struggle to find that energy again. But as far as the Conservative Party is concerned, and possibly also as far as the Labour Party is concerned, a significant figure trumpeting the advantages of Scottish independence has now been effectively silenced and taken away. And they will look with interest to see who else can take her place to do that. For the government will take comfort in the fact that, as will the opposition party, the Labour Party as well, that thus far there is no politician in the Scottish Nationalist Party who holds that kind of candle, who has that kind of reputation. The polls have all evened percentages on any number of 5, 6, 7 potential candidates in the SNP to take over as leader. There is no great leader waiting in the wings to lead the force of Scottish independence back to another punch-up with Westminster.
Andrew, thank you. Our correspondent, Andrew Wilson. China's most senior diplomat, Wang Yi, has arrived in Paris to meet French President Emmanuel Macron. The visit comes ahead of an expected visit by President Macron to Beijing later this year. Wang Yi will also visit Italy, Hungary and Russia and attend the Munich Security Conference. Well, let's talk to our correspondent, Ross Cullen, watching events for us in Paris. Ross, do we know what was discussed at their meeting?
Yeah, Jamie, that meeting ended earlier this afternoon behind closed doors for Wang Yi holding talks with Emmanuel Macron at the Élysée Palace, the French presidential residence and office. There would have been a lot of topics on the agenda, from trade and technology, bilateral relations more generally, but also the specific focus as well on where they can work together. There are areas of alignment between Paris and Beijing, particularly on fighting the climate emergency. Both countries for years now have been trying to work together, reducing emissions, increasing the use of renewable energies, and trying to protect biodiversity and animals at risk of extinction. They will be working together overall when it comes to a focus on dialogue and the wider geopolitical issues, but there are some other areas where they aren't perfectly aligned. They also will be discussing the Indo-Pacific. France sees it as a domestic arena with 1.5 million citizens, 8,000 troops in the Indian and Pacific Oceans. Of course, geographically, at the very least, it is also an area of Chinese influence. The war in Ukraine, as far as France and Ukraine see it, would also have been discussed. That was on the agenda. China describes it as the Ukraine crisis. Russia describes it as a special military operation. But there is certainly worth pointing out the fact that Wang Yi did want to come to France to speak to a key Western ally of the United States and a Western ally of Ukraine. He will also be visiting Russia on his way back home to China at the end of his tour of nations. But the meeting with Emmanuel Macron, the French president and China's top diplomat, is over now, Jamie, and there will be further meetings this evening with France's Foreign Minister, Catherine Colonna.
Ross, another big international trip, of course, later in the year. President Macron expected to visit China later in the year. Give us an idea what will be top of that agenda for that meeting.
Yes, Wang Yi would have wanted to raise that possibility as well, hoping to lay the groundwork for a possible trip to China by French President Emmanuel Macron, where the key centrepiece of that trip would be talks with Xi Jinping, the Chinese president. The two men did speak at the sidelines of the G20 in Indonesia last year, but both Paris and Beijing hoping that they can carry out a full formal trip for President Macron to China at some point during this year. So Wang Yi and Emmanuel Macron and their advisers would have been starting to try to lay the groundwork for that. I expect this evening's dinner. There's meant to be a banquet hosted by the French Foreign Ministry. Wang Yi has been invited by his French counterpart, Catherine Colonna. There will be further discussions about bilateral relations more generally and about this possible trip by Emmanuel Macron specifically.
Ross, thank you for that. Our correspondent Ross Cullen in Paris. You're watching CGTN, still ahead. Building the brand, why some of the world's top sporting clubs are missing out on millions.
Events have consequences. Words create impact.
Unprecedented scenes that we saw.
The clean-up operation is now well and truly underway.
parts of southern Europe remain in a state of emergency.
Context gives meaning. People make history.
Far more than 1,000 people have come here today.
But authorities are still on high alert.
So now we've actually become the border on this road.
A complex world demands a comprehensive view.
But with the cleanup efforts more or less under control,
the economic impact is bound to ripple across the country.
There's plastic pollution everywhere.
Because the world today matters for your world tomorrow.
This is the living area of the crew.
The focus is firmly on future technologies.
Well, this is something completely different.
The world today, every day on CGTN.
Hello, welcome back to Global Business Europe. The world's top football clubs could be missing out on a combined annual revenue of $900 million by not building fan loyalty. The latest Fan Relationship Index report says clubs need to better understand a new generation of digital-savvy fans. Football lovers in Brazil spend the most, shelling out an average of $206 a year to fly the flag of their favourite team. Fans in the UK and Spain come just a little bit behind. When you break that down by club, it's fans of Premier League champions Manchester City who spend the most, just over $250 each per year. Brazilian giants Flamengo come a close second. And the impact of better understanding what fans want can, of course, be seen in the US Major Basketball League and National Football League. Their average revenue per fan is 10 times higher than the leading European football clubs. Well, let's talk now to Neil Joyce, Chief Executive Officer of the company behind that report, CLV Group. Neil, welcome. First of all, what should European football clubs be doing to enhance fans' experience and, more to the point, get them to spend a load more?
I think you remarked upon this early straight away, that it all starts with an understanding of fans and investing proportionately to fans, not just fans who go to games, which is where a lot of the financials today stem from, but looking beyond that. So look at the fans of Manchester City or Manchester United or Chelsea who are in the United States or in the Middle East, for instance, as well. Football teams in Europe right now only realistically understand about 5% of their global fan bases. The insights produced within the report actually starts to surface the 95% of unknown fans. So to better understand those fans allows you to then understand the needs and wants of those fans and marry them up against digital propositions such as new loyalty programs underpinned by Web3 technologies, virtual streaming, and also matchday experiences. Much of the today is about capacity and matchday fans. Digital propositions give you limitless capacity.
I mean, it's worth saying the NBA and the NFL, I think, make 10 times the amount of money per fan than European footy clubs. What are they doing differently?
They've optimised on the matchday fan. So they charge a lot higher matchday ticket prices to go and watch an NBA game. There's volumes of game that far outstrip the Premier League. So in the Premier League alone, as we know, there's 38 games per season. You start to look at NBA and there's over 100 plus per season as well. So volume of games, optimizing ticket prices, which is what's happened in the US, has forged the path. Also, you look to the NBA, they've really done a great job of engaging with fans in global markets like China, where they've increased revenue through streaming propositions into that marketplace. So the signs are there for what the Premier League teams and the European teams need to follow. It's just a case of really investing heavily in understanding and unlocking the opportunities around those global fans who they don't know who they are right now.
Neil, you say optimising ticket prices. I mean, that means sticking ticket prices up a huge amount. I mean, let's be fair, we're in the middle of a big cost of living crisis, not just in Europe, but all around the world. I mean, going to a football match is already eye-wateringly expensive. I mean, seriously, are you going to really persuade football fans to part with even more of their money?
Yeah, in line with that, within the analysis that we conducted, surprisingly at first glance, fans used to ask for preferential treatment of getting tickets to games through traditional membership programs. Our analysis showed that actually that isn't the case. Fans want discounts on ticket prices now. The real opportunity for these big European teams is to look at monetizing global fans who don't go to games and pay ticket prices and reinvest those revenues back into the match day loyal fans, either by subsidizing ticket prices or in some cases giving away tickets for free. And that's obviously in line with understanding current economic factors, but also rewarding longer-term loyalty of those fans that have always gone to those games.
Neil, good to see you. Thanks very much for coming on the programme. That's Neil Joyce from the CLV Group. Now, Airbnb has recorded its first full year of profitability as global travel rebounds. The holiday rental company had its most profitable fourth quarter ever to help give it a net income of almost $2 billion. Cross-border trips were up 49% year-on-year in quarter four, and outbound travel from the Asia-Pacific region showed the strongest growth. Shares jumped almost 10% in pre-market trading. The Grammy Award-winning musician Pharrell Williams has been appointed as the new creative director for menswear at Louis Vuitton. Williams collaborated with the fashion house on a sunglasses range in 2004, and his first collection will go on show at Fashion Week in Paris in June. Now, if you bought red roses for Valentine's Day, you probably don't need reminding of those three little words that accompany the purchase. The words, seriously, how much? Inflation in the US has added to the cost of celebrating Valentine's Day, with spending expected to hit record levels. CGTN's correspondent Jim Spellman reports.
Saying I love you on Valentine's Day is big business in the United States. According to the National Retail Federation, more than half of consumers will celebrate, spending nearly $200 each, up about 10% over last year, driven in part by inflation. Topping the list of most popular gifts, candy, especially chocolate.
From a business perspective, it's our second biggest holiday after Christmas. You know, we're very optimistic about the holiday. I mean, people love chocolate, you know, and it's a nice little break and a treat for people. So we do see people coming back, spending money, consuming at good levels.
Next on the list, greeting cards, followed by flowers. Valentine's Day is the biggest day of the year for florists. You can't go wrong with roses, red, of course. In fact, more than 250 million roses are produced for Valentine's Day each year. Rounding out the Valentine's spending list, a romantic evening out, and jewelry. Inflation means higher prices for some items, but that doesn't seem to be holding consumers back.
I think we all realize that that inflation is around us everywhere, no matter where we go, and it's in flowers as well. But, you know, I don't think you can put a price tag on the cost of love.
It may be true that you can't put a price on the cost of love, but according to the National Retail Federation, spending this Valentine's Day will add up to nearly $26 billion, about $2 billion more than last year. That's a lot of love. Jim Spellman, CGTN, Washington.
Last of the big spenders. The headlines again. The death toll from the earthquakes in Syria and Turkey reaches 41,000 people as the United Nations appeals for funding to try to rebuild the region. Our other headlines: politics is brutal. The words of Scotland's departing First Minister Nicola Sturgeon as she resigns, casting uncertainty over the Scottish independence movement. And thousands of Lufthansa passengers find themselves stranded around the world after the airline is hit by an IT meltdown. And that's it for Global Business Europe. Thank you for watching. More on all of our stories at europe.cgtn.com, and do follow CGTN Europe on Twitter, Facebook and Instagram. We're on smart TV apps, Roku, Apple TV, Amazon Fire and Android TV, YouTube, Dailymotion, CGTN.com and the CGTN app, and in the UK on Freeview. Coming up next on CGTN, it's Africa Live. We'll see you again tomorrow, same time, same place. From all of the team in London, it's goodbye.